Ok. Buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Antes que nada, una disculpa por el retraso en la iniciación de este evento. Contamos con la presencia del maestro Eduardo Vega, director de la Facultad de Economía, y quien va a presentar el tema de hoy es el profesor Anwar Shaikh, que viene de la universidad de la que somos egresados, Ignacio Perrotini y un servidor, de New School for Social Research de la ciudad de Nueva York. Van a presentar su libro, acaba de salir recientemente, se llama Capitalism, y que va a ser próximamente traducido y publicado por el Fondo de Cultura Económica en español, Fondo de Cultura México. Vamos a iniciar con las palabras del maestro Eduardo Vega. Enseguida hará uso de la palabra el coordinador, el coordinador del posgrado, el doctor Ignacio Perrotini. Más adelante el doctor Carlos Guerrero de Lizardi, jefe de la División de Estudios de Posgrado de la Facultad, y iniciará pues más tarde el doctor Anwar Shaikh su presentación del libro ya mencionado. Damos la palabra entonces al maestro Eduardo Vega.
Muchísimas gracias, Pablo. Entiendo que sí está prendido, perdonen. Muchas gracias, Pablo. Buenas tardes a todos. Yo simplemente voy a robarles un minuto y medio tal vez, porque todos queremos escuchar al profesor Shaikh, para eso estamos aquí reunidos. La Facultad de Economía está muy complacida con la visita del profesor Anwar Shaikh de la New School for Social Research de New York, como ya se mencionó, muy conocido e influyente académicamente hablando, profesor Shaikh, que ha contribuido de manera destacada al pensamiento marxista contemporáneo, y la Facultad de Economía, siendo, como todos sabemos, una institución universitaria que forma economistas con aproximación plural a nuestra disciplina, está muy complacida en tenerlo en esta ocasión y también el día de mañana en el edificio principal de la facultad, en el Ho Chi Minh, pero en esta ocasión aquí nos da mucho gusto recibirle, profesor Shaikh. Y precisamente el motivo no único, pero principal para el día de hoy es dar a conocer en México, en el mundo de habla hispana, de hecho, por este intermedio, de su más reciente libro, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict and Crisis. Gracias. Quiero cerrar diciendo que agradezco muy de veras el entusiasmo y la colaboración para hacer posible traer al profesor Anwar Shaikh a compartir con él su contribución académica más reciente en nuestra facultad, al coordinador de nuestro posgrado en Economía de la UNAM, al profesor Ignacio Perrotini, quien conversando junto con él tuvo esa iniciativa y esa voluntad de institucional y universitaria de invitarle. Igualmente, en este mismo esfuerzo colaboró de manera muy activa nuestro jefe del posgrado, el profesor Carlos Guerrero de Lizardi, y señaladamente también de manera muy entusiasta y siempre comprometido con este tipo de iniciativas académicas, el profesor Pablo Ruiz Nápoles, a quien también agradezco mucho. Sin más, yo le pasaría la palabra a quienes formalmente han hecho posible que estemos reunidos con el profesor Shaikh para que demos paso a la actividad académica. Muy amables. Carlos.
Buenas tardes. Es un gusto compartir ese espacio con todos ustedes. Profesor Shaikh, thanks a lot. Indeed, thanks a lot. Estamos celebrando la presentación de este nuevo libro que costó muchos años al profesor Shaikh, como nos platicará más adelante, 15 años, creo, en gestarse, en tener la última versión. También estamos celebrando 75 años de la revista Investigación Económica, que es el producto de investigación más notable que tenemos en economía, en nuestra facultad, es un producto de todos nosotros, y en el país, y también los 80 años de la teoría general de Keynes. Entonces, hoy el profesor Shaikh va a darnos esta conferencia para presentarnos su libro en este auditorio, y mañana a las 12 en el Ho Chi Minh, una conferencia sobre Marx y Keynes, para celebrar esto, ¿verdad? Los 80 años de la teoría general. Entonces, no me resta que darle la bienvenida, que disfrutemos todos mucho esta actividad el día de hoy y de mañana. Muchas gracias, profesor Shaikh.
Bien, buenas tardes. Yo solamente quiero decir una cosa muy sencilla. Creo que todos venimos con el ánimo de escuchar a Anwar, y quiero darle la bienvenida y decirles que pues aquí estamos personas que podemos ayudar a traducir las preguntas que quieran formular. Siéntanse con la confianza de formular sus preguntas, y vamos a hacer el esfuerzo por traducirlo al inglés para que Anwar pueda responder. Y les quiero anunciar que en la división de estudios de posgrado, en esta biblioteca nuestra, tenemos ya 2 ejemplares del libro, así es que los pueden consultar. So Anwar, welcome to Mexico once again, welcome to UNAM. We are very happy to have you here with us. I know this is also your house because you've been with us many times, and we are really eager to listen to your presentation of your most recent book, which is the result of many, many years of rigorous work. Welcome again. Now, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ignacio, and thank you for UNAM for inviting me back. I've been here before, but it's been a long time, and I'm now a refugee from Trump, USA, so thank you for taking me in. If we look at the world today, we see that there are some strong patterns that emerge. And if we have only orthodox theory as the foundation to explain these patterns, we have to make up a series of ad hoc explanations. I want to show you, I want to argue that one can construct a systematic framework from micro to macro, the theory of consumer behavior, the theory of the firm, and the theory of macro dynamics, in which the patterns that we observe are the ones that you would expect. Not because of some imperfections, but because that is what capitalism does. And so that's why my book is called Capitalism. It's not about Marx, it's not about Keynes, it's not about Walras or Harrod, or all of those things are discussed there. It is about this object of investigation. And I chose to focus it on the center countries for 2 reasons. One is that the center is where the patterns are most clearly visible, and after all, the center is the strongest part. So we can see the patterns in the center, we can see how they manifest themselves also in the developing world. So, and the other reason, of course, is that the book is 1,024 pages, and at some point you have to stop so that you can pull the story together. This is a copy of the book which is available in your library. There are 2 copies, so I ask you to take a look at it. It's not an easy read, and I hope to someday write a simpler version, but I'm happy to say that it's being translated into Spanish, so that hopefully that version will be available in some time in the future. So what is it that we see on the world scale? We see globalization. We see so-called free trade. We see inequality. We see growth in some countries and stagnation in others. We see employment in some areas and displacement of labor and unemployment in others. And we see cycles of boom and then peaking and then collapse, such as what happened in 2008. What I want to show you is that all of these patterns are absolutely normal in the sense that they are intrinsic even in the center countries. And that then gives us a base from which to proceed to talk about development and the historical expansion of the global market. So the central feature of the last 3 decades has been the expansion of the domain of markets. And that raises the question, what do markets do? Now, these are specific markets that we're talking about. These are capitalist markets. So what is the history of the capitalist markets? What is the theory of capitalist market? And then what are the policy implications of that? And you cannot read history and talk about policy without having theory. So one of my points is to show you that we can have a theory. It's been there in bits and pieces, sometimes buried through modifications and through partial appropriations, but it's there, and it can explain to us how the system operates and why we get the outcomes we do. So the first stop in that theoretical investigation is to ask, what do capitalist markets do best? And the answer is, they make profits. If you understand that that is their driving force, that is their success measure, then many of the other things, such as employment and unemployment, such as a massive number of people on a world scale who have either unemployment or partial employment. According to official statistics, there's something like 550 million people on the world scale who are unemployed and underemployed. That is what you would expect if you understand how profit works. Employment is a side effect. Profit is the primary effect. Now, my book, as I said, which is called Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crises, is designed to show that there is a path from micro to macro which does not rely in any way whatsoever on the standard optimizing, rational choice, rational expectations, equilibrium, Pareto optimality, or any of that nonsense. And I'm going to argue specifically why it is nonsense and why it came about historically, politically. But the important thing is to recognize that it's nonsense does not give you an alternative. And that's partly what took me so long, was to go from the recognition that it was clearly a misrepresentation of capitalism to the question of how one can actually represent the system. And one of the key points in the book is that the driving element is actually competition. Not the competition that is presented in orthodox economics, perfect competition and optimality, but real competition. And I'm going to talk more about what I mean by real competition. But the book demonstrates that you can use those ideas to explain concretely relative prices, exchange rates, interest rates, and many other things. One important thing that I'm going to come back to is the idea that you can explain how so-called free trade operates. What happens when you open up trade between countries? Does it produce the outcomes that the textbooks say, or does it produce the outcomes we observe? And the answer is the outcomes we observe are to be expected and are perfectly natural if you understand how the system works. So the focus of my book, as I said, is on capitalism in the developed world. And that's because the main mechanisms originate there, and they can be seen clearly there. But my book is not a theoretical work. It is also empirical. Almost 50% of the book is data. And that is why the book is so big, because I want to show that the understanding that you can develop can be contrasted to neoclassical economics, to post-Keynesian economics, to the Marxian traditions such as Baran and Sweezy and others, and also to the empirical evidence. Always the center is the actual of investigation is the actual evidence and not what other people have said. They are measured, so to speak, by their ability to understand the real patterns. So we want to be able to understand why there are some recurrent patterns, and I'm going to try to show you these in the center. Patterns of development and underdevelopment, inequality, employment and unemployment, wealth and poverty, people being brought into the system and other people being displaced and never picked up. And if we understand that the driving force of this is competition driven by the profit motive, then many things become very sensible. There is today in the world no vaccine for malaria, even though malaria kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. Why is that? It's not profitable. There, on the other hand, huge production of tobacco, huge production of pornography. Why? Because it is highly profitable. And instead of accusing the system of being imperfect, we should understand that that is the perfection of profitability. It finds its way into those arenas which are good for profit. But then we should not be surprised or shocked by the fact that environmental degradation or poverty or unemployment can also be consequences of the same dynamic. And this is something I want to try and show you, especially when we talk about free trade, which I'm going to come back to. Now, competition and conflict are intrinsic features of capitalist society. Inequality has always been there, and it's persistent. And booms and busts are recurrent patterns, and I'm going to show you some of that in the data. But then that raises the question, what about the state? Does not the state intervene to modify the system? The answer is yes. Does it abolish these patterns? The answer is no, and I will try and show you that it does not abolish them, it modifies them. Why is that? Because the state we're speaking of is a capitalist state, and it rides on top of the profit motive. We're not talking about a revolutionary state which overthrows the profit motive. We're talking about a state which seeks to channel the profit motive. And the profit motive is the mightiest river in human history. And to channel it, you can push it a little bit, but it can overflow the banks periodically because it is an extremely powerful force. For instance, in the center countries alone, in the developed world, we've had 3 Great Depressions in the last 85 years. And I'm going to show you there were more before that. The Great Depression of the 1930s, which we often call the Great Depression, but also the stagflation crisis of the 1970s, which is actually a depression, and the current crisis, which began in 2007-2008, which is also a Great Depression, the massive effects on a world scale. So I want to show that these are natural and they recur for a reason, and I want to talk about the dynamics of that and then some of the implication. As I said before, this book is developed in a way that you can explain microeconomics. I'm going to show you how, demand curves and elasticities, without having any reference to utility, maximizing behavior, optimality. The elements were already there for a long time. You can explain relative prices. You can explain, I'm sorry, so let me back up. You can explain all of these patterns without anything about perfection, and therefore without anything about imperfection. This is a trap. If you get presented with a story that is perfect, then the trap is to think that the way you make the story better is to modify it to become imperfect. Now, I think that is a trap because it makes you part of that church. You are constantly saying, well, okay, it's not really the way they say it, and there are some priests and bishops who are not so nice either, but if we allow for that, then the results come out. I think that's a mistake. If you're going to move away from this false beginning, you have to have another place to stand. And that's what I want to show you today. It can be developed and developed in a simple and natural way. The issue is not about abstraction. All theories are abstract at the beginning. The issue is whether the abstraction finds the fundamental properties of the system and seeks to begin from that, or whether it idealizes the system because it is moving the question from how the system behaves to a question of how a fantasy system should behave. And if you've read neoclassical economics, you know that as the structure of the argument, and indeed that was the political motivation for the original construction of these ideas. So markets do work. They work at making profit. They do balance, but they achieve their balance by going too far in one direction and then falling too far in the other direction. So their balance is through imbalance. As Marx puts it somewhere, the order is produced in and through disorder. The disorder is not an accidental side effect, it's the intrinsic mechanism of the order. So we cannot talk about a system in perfect order and then talk about disorder as a second order issue, an externality or an imperfection. The disorder is the mechanism of the balancing, and therefore it's part of the order. The big mistake and the big lie of orthodox economics is to claim that profit, which is good for capital, is good for people and good for society. And it is that construction which, of course, leads us into this idea that trade is good for nations, that full employment is a natural outcome of the behavior of firms and all of that. And I address these issues in considerable detail because I did not want the book to be just a question of assertions. I develop a framework in which I show that I can deal with the same issues without having to have the same starting point. Now the book, as I said, develops microeconomics and macroeconomics from real behavior and real competition. And I'm going to explain what real competition is in a while. And it uses it to explain economic patterns in demand and supply of microeconomics, the typical thing you begin a neoclassical textbook with, wages and profits, technical change, the relative prices of goods, concretely, the empirical prices of different goods in the center countries, interest rates, the theory of interest rates, the history of interest rates, how they're determined and how they can be modified, bond and equity prices, the stock market, exchange rates, patterns of international trade, why imbalances of trade are natural and normal in competition, growth, how is it driven, what are the factors that affect it, what's the role of effective demand in pumping up growth, and what are the limits to effective demand, unemployment, the recurrence of a natural rate of unemployment, not in the sense of Friedman, but in the sense that the system produces a normal pool of unemployed people. And where unemployment becomes too narrow, it finds ways to bring in more people or to displace people through mechanization and fill that pool again. National and personal inequality. The last chapter of the book talks about how to extend these ideas to development, but also to kind of discussions in Piketty, which can be developed perfectly naturally from this foundation, not as some special pattern. And the recurrence of general crises. Now, all of these outcomes that I'm talking about have their counterparts in the developing world. International trade is very important for development, as it is in the center. Protectionism, import substitution policies, which are crucially dependent on some understanding of how foreign trade works, the mobility of capital, foreign direct investment, modernization of technology and its effects on employment and profitability, and of course international competition on a world scale. Why does China, and before it Japan, and before that Germany and South Korea, why do they become successful in the world trade and therefore successful as capitalist countries? I argue that there's a simple explanation for that, which has to do with how competition operates on a world scale. before I proceed any further, the book is a difficult book, and I hope someday to write a simpler version of it, but I didn't want to write the simple version first because it's easier to go from the big to the small than from the small to the big. So, and you never know how long you will live. So I wanted to finish the thing in itself, and then let's see. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are, if you have to read it for first draft, Chapter 1 and 2, because they lay out the general structure of the methodology and the arguments in the book. And Chapter 2 summarizes every chapter of the book. So even if you don't read them, you can claim that you have a pretty good idea what they're about. And then Chapter 16, which is about the current crisis and its implication for global accumulation. And Chapter 17, which is how to use these to develop other problems, as I said, inequality, Piketty, development, wage dispersions, econophysics, all of that. Now, let me say right away that the problem, in my opinion, with orthodox economics is not mathematics. Mathematics is a tool, like econometrics, and it's useful sometimes if the question you have fits the mathematics and vice versa. The problem is that orthodox economics has a fantastical vision of capitalism. So the mathematics is that adapted to exploring that fantastical vision. And you can use usually not the same mathematics, but other mathematics to explore the actual dynamics of capitalism. Marx, for instance, wrote a book, I suppose many people don't know this, wrote a book on calculus because he was interested in explaining what he called the ups and downs of accumulation, which is what we call business cycles. And he understood that this would require some formal technique, so he began to study calculus. And then he got so annoyed with the way calculus was constructed that he took, I don't know, he had no spare time. I have no idea how people like this do that because they were busy working on a million things at the same time. But he wrote a little book on the foundations of calculus. Not a little book, actually, a substantial book on how to refound calculus in order to develop it more adequately. So, with this in mind, let me move to the presentation because I want to show you that when we're talking about capitalism, we should have an idea of what it is, what it does, especially in the center, because that's very important. This is the book, which you can see here, and you can see on that page, and as I said, is in your library. And the object of investigation of this book is the actual system. So I discuss all economic theories, including the classical Keynesian synthesis that I present in this book, and the neoclassical and post-Keynesian and Marxian theories of capitalism in that light. I reject any notion of perfect competition. I think it's a humbug. And for that same reason, I also reject imperfect competition because it is trapped in the web of perfect competition. If we're going to get out of that, we have to have another place to stand. And I focus on the structural ordering and disordering of the system. So let me show you a little bit about what I mean. This is the table of contents of the book. The first 16 chapters. There's a 17th chapter, but it doesn't fit on the PowerPoint, so it's the mystery chapter. It's a summary. But I draw your attention to the part that is in red, which is the website that is set up for this book, in which every discussion of the book, people using it for teaching, people doing commentaries, there are mistakes in the book, so people cataloging the mistakes, all the data in the book is available there for your use. Everything that I present here is there, and every piece of data has documentation of how it was developed. So if I did it incorrectly, you will find it and you can correct it. I also have there lectures, video lectures on the book, which are 28 lectures that go through from chapter 1 to the last chapter 17. They're for a graduate level course, but you should be able to get an idea of the structure of the book without having to read it Hopefully you would also read it, but in any case, since many people prefer to watch and listen than to read, that's the other way to get to that material. As I said, what I'm going to be talking about is a subset of the book material. There have been plenty more in the book, but in the minutes that I have left, I can only talk about some. So let me first talk about consumer behavior. As you know, if you pick up a book on microeconomics, they start you with exactly what I show here, which is a budget line. Imagine that we have two goods. I've called one a luxury good and the other a necessary good, and we have a certain amount of income. If the necessary good has a minimum, that's all makes it necessary, then you cannot spend all your income on luxury goods. You have to spend at least some of it on necessary goods. So the budget line that you can utilize, that the effective budget line, is that one in dark. It's that portion of your disposable income that you can spend on either luxuries or necessaries. Now, the key point is that I learned from my teacher of microeconomics. My teachers of microeconomics as a graduate student at Columbia were Bill Vickery, who got a Nobel Prize in microeconomics, and Gary Becker, who got a Nobel Prize in microeconomics. I never believed anything they said in terms of their starting point, though they were wonderful teachers and brilliant people. It's just a different starting point. You know, if you don't believe that God created the Garden of Eden, then you're going to have some problem if you go into biology. So my difficulty was that starting point made no sense to me. However, in 1963, Gary Becker showed, and he did this in our class, and I remember being stunned by it, that all the things that we had just derived with utility and optimizing and maximizing could be derived without any reference whatsoever to that foundation. And so here is my homage to my teacher, which is that imagine that there is a point on this budget line which represents the average result of the behavior of everybody in this room. Now, you're all different people. You come from different parts of this country. You come from different parts of the world. You have different histories, different genders, different preferences. And yet, if we look at this collectivity, we usually see a pretty stable outcome, provided something doesn't disrupt these foundations. We see that your patterns of consumption repeat, and because they're socially structured. That's not a surprise. So that social structuring gives you a point. And that's the point I show in the middle of that curve, which represents the average of all the collective individual behaviors, which are socially structured. Now imagine that we make one of the goods more expensive. So the budget line, which is here, shifts inside because the necessary good has become more expensive, so you cannot buy as much of it, and so your feasible space is shifted. It's very easy to show that if you have a stable propensity to consume on average, then your average consumption of the necessary good will go down. Not all of you. Some of you may choose to buy more, some may choose less, but the average will go down because the space itself is restricted, and you will fall somewhere in that space according to a stable propensity to consume. And that is enough, as it turns out, to derive downward sloping demand curves. I show in the book that it does not depend on the behavior of the individuals. And to show this, I adapt from my own teacher, Becker, the models, but I present 4 different models. One is everybody here is a perfect utility maximizer, rational agent, completely selfish, and completely alike. Now, you've read micro. I see people laughing, smiling in pain, perhaps, because that's how you start microeconomics. So, of course, one of the models is that. But then the other model is you're completely rational, selfish, and all of that, but not alike. Now, if you know microeconomics, you know that you can no longer have a representative agent then because it doesn't work. The third one is where all of you are purely impulsive, what Becker calls impulsive, random behavior. You choose from your set every day a different outcome. As you know from probability theory, the average will be quite stable precisely because you choose randomly, you'll have an average mean. And the fourth is that I divide the room into 2 parts. Older people who look around and see what other people are doing and they move in that direction, they imitate, and younger people who are trying to make something new, so they innovate. So we can do it in an agent-based model. All of these are done in agent-based models. And they produce a stable outcome because you have a mixture of the two and they mutate and develop over time. That's easy to do. This is adapted from an argument by Giovanni Dossi in Italy. But the two curves here you see are the demand curves for necessary goods and the demand curves for luxury goods. Each one of those graphs has got 4 curves in it, one from the perfect neoclassical model, the second from the extended neoclassical model, the third from the random, and the fourth from the innovate model. The point is you can show mathematically that if you have a stable outcome in the aggregate, it does not matter what the micro behavior is. And this is a point I pick up from a physicist by the name of Robert Laughlin, who argues that it's actually true of physics. There is no law in physics, he says, which is derived from micro foundations. In fact, we know you can't go from quantum mechanics to relativity theory in general. And anyway, the laws in physics are still true, even though they're not derived from quantum mechanics, because they are valid laws. So the laws of demand, and I show there other laws, the consumption function of Keynesian economics, Engels' law of the elasticities, income elasticities, and price elasticities of necessary and luxury goods. Basically, the first 200 pages of your micro textbook, I can show the same results, but I don't have to waste any time on optimizing, maximizing, and pretending that people only care about themselves. Think for a moment what it means to say that each one of us cares about nothing else than what we can get. Not our family, not our nation, not our parents, not our friends, that we don't care what happens to anything except ourselves. There has not ever been, nor will ever be, a human society that will be like that. In fact, I would argue there's no society in nature, no group in nature that can behave that way. So then you have to ask yourself, what could possibly have motivated a 100-year development of such a bizarre statement of society? And my argument is because this is the only way that you can present capitalism as the perfect social form. General equilibrium, Pareto optimality. Pareto optimality tells you, perhaps you all know, that if I go across the room here and I find 5 richest people and I give them $1 million, you will not mind because they're richer and you're no worse off. Well, every politician knows that if they get caught because their friends the 5 friends got these $1 million and nobody else got anything more, they would be out in office like that. Because people care about the relative outcomes. They care about their relative position. They care about what could have been. And none of that appears in orthodox economics. So it is, as I said, a complete humbug. Here is the US Industrial Index from I can't see the graph myself from this distance, but it's about 1870 or something, 1850. So I take it back as far as there's data. And the two things you see when you look in a successful capitalist country is it grows, and it grows in an erratic, fluctuating way. So how bizarre is it that most of modern economics begins with a static economy in some kind of perfect equilibrium, even if it's a growth equilibrium? There is no such thing, and there cannot be in the way capitalism operates. This is the per capita, the index of investment, and you can see investment grows, but not as much, and it grows much more erratically. And this is a point that Keynes makes, that investment is highly erratic because it depends on estimations of the future. And production estimates the future in the short run. What will happen when you finish the production? Can you sell it? Investment has to make an estimate of what happens when you make the plant and equipment, and it's going to last 40 years. Are you going to be able to predict 40 years? Well, naturally, when things change, you change your opinion of that future, so investment fluctuates a lot more. This is GDP per capita, and this is a very important point. Where capitalism is successful, it has been able to raise the average per capita income of the people inside. That's precisely why the gap between the developing world and the developed world provokes migration, because people want to get into this higher standard of living. These are cycles. This is data produced by a bank called the Cleveland Trust Company. And you may ask, well, why do banks care about business cycles? Surely the answer is, of course they have to care, because they have to lend you money, and whether they get it back depends on whether or not the economy goes down or up. Because if it goes down, they lose. So they were very deeply concerned. And these are business cycles beginning in, again, I can't see that far back. I should have brought my own printouts, but 1831. So it's 1831 to 1862. They're roughly 30 years windows I'm going to show you. But I want to draw your attention to that yellow area there, which is the period of the 1840s, the late 1840s, which was a Great Depression. In fact, it was such a severe depression that there was a movement of workers to overthrow capitalism, and two young postgraduate students called Marx and Engels were in the streets trying to overthrow capitalism. Marx in Europe, and especially in Paris, and Engels actually with an army of workers trying to overthrow German capitalism. They failed and ended up in England as exiles. This is the next period, the 1867 to 1900 something, too. And again, you can see these patterns, the normal patterns of fluctuations. And you see an event there, which is the Great Depression of 1873 to 1893. An event so serious, it's officially called the Long Depression. And a young man named Sigmund Freud is very worried about his future because he doesn't know whether he'll be able to get a job, what's going to happen to the family, are there going to be a war. Anti-Semitism comes up typically in these periods. So these are events that are well documented, so to speak, and they are a natural consequence of the way the capitalist system creates balance. It overshoots, and then it undershoots. And some of these overshoots are big overshoots. The rest are the normal fluctuations. If you get the book that's cited there, you will see that every one of these ups and downs is given a name in the business cycle literature. But the names are so many that I couldn't fit them all in, so I focused only on the depressions. This is the next period, and this encompasses, it begins in 1903, as far as I can see from here, and goes to 1939. But I draw your attention to that last big event there, highlighted in yellow, which is what we call the Great Depression of 1929. So already by 1929, 1930, we've had three major depressions. I don't have data for the earliest one, which is 1825. And this is in the center. They recur, and they recur with extraordinary similarity on the order of 40 to 50 years, including the current one, as I'm going to show you. This is data on productivity and real wages, beginning in the 1870s and going on to the present. And you can see that the blue line, which is real wages, and the dark black line, which is productivity, appear to move together in the late 1800s, and then even in the early 1900s, in the post-war period also. And then they diverge sharply. That divergence is the beginning of the neoliberal era. It begins with Reagan attacking the welfare state and unions in the US, and Thatcher attacking the welfare state and unions in England. And these are the two center countries. And this tells you that the relationship between productivity and real wages is not a mechanical one. It's not a production function. It's a social relation. And we know very well what happened in that period. I'm going to skip that. This is unemployment data beginning in the 1870s, coming up to the present. And I draw your attention to the fact that unemployment shoots up in depressions and then comes back down and then shoots up again, or stabilizes, then comes up again and then down. But something important here. You see in the second half of the post-war period, there are two depressions. The great stagflation. First, let me go back. The first picture you see, the top is the first peak is the Great Depression of the 1870s now. Then the second peak is the Great Depression of the 1929 to 1939. You see unemployment rises to 25%. Then the third one is the great stagflation, where unemployment rises to 10%, and the current one about 10%. This is all in the United States, the most powerful center country of the world. And the point I want to make here is that unemployment does rise, but the extent of it is mediated by state policy. We know that Keynesian policy pumped up the economy in an effort to prevent the unemployment from rising to 25%, which would cause a massive social upheaval. But in the process, they produced inflation. And in this particular era, they didn't do it that way, didn't pump it up. But they kept businesses alive by giving them huge sums of money. Automobile industry, the banking sector, we know that. So they kept the unemployment from spreading. So the state can have an effect. But the important point is it doesn't actually change the patterns. This is the behavior of wholesale prices in the UK and the United States, the two major capitalist countries, beginning from 1780 to 2010. And if you look in the first part that is not shaded, you will see that the behavior has waves. These are the long waves that Kondratiev identifies. And he was quite right that capitalism has these long waves. But you notice that in the second shaded part, which is the post-war period, prices just rise. They never come down. So something fundamental changes to prices. And one of the things I want to show you is that you can have a theory of inflation that explains this in a very natural way. But here, it seems that Kondratiev is wrong. But in the back of Kondratiev's book, he has an appendix where he measured prices in a different way. He measures American prices not in dollars, but in gold, and UK prices not in British pounds, but in gold. And if you take that data and extend it, as I have done here, lo and behold, all of the Kondratiev waves come back. So Kondratiev's mistake, a sad error, was that he didn't graph both sets. And this is not surprising. If you had to do these graphs by hand, it took a long time and a lot of work. Now we just press a button in Excel and the graph appears, but you had to do it by hand. You have to calculate these numbers and do it. And he did put them in the appendix. Unfortunately, people didn't read the book. Otherwise, this could have been done. I'm not the first to think of that, but it could have been done a long time ago. The second point I want to bring out to you is Kondratiev argued that on the downside of these long waves is when you get these great crises. And that first one there, if you look at the graph, you'll see it going up, and on the downside comes the shaded area, and that's the Great Depression of 1825. Then you have a kind of upside, a recovery, and then you get a second one of the 1840s. Then you get a rise again, and you get a third of the 1929. That's a Great Depression. The modern era, I may be off here because I can't see any of the labels, but anyway, you can see after World War II, you get that big peak. Of World War I, you get that big peak. And then you get a Great Depression in 1929, then the recovery in the post-war period, and then the stagflation crisis, then the recovery in the 1970s, and then the crisis of 2008. Now, what is really, really interesting is that all of these, if you smooth the data, if you use a Hodrick-Prescott filter, for instance, to smooth the data, and it take the last two episodes in the 20th century, the time from the peak to the beginning of the Great Depression is about 8 or 9 years. So around 2003, because I presented this data for many, many years, I've been presenting this material for 30 years in my classes, I began to say, well, if that is on schedule and the peak is in 2003, the next Great Depression should be 2008 and 2009. And it was essentially on schedule. It was 2007, 2008. So this raises a question. If the government is controlling the economy, how come the economy is in fact exhibiting the same pattern? And the answer is the government does not control profitability. It tries to control some of the effects of profitability, but it does not change the internal dynamic. How much time do I have?
It's up to you.
Okay.
Plenty of time.
Okay, so here is the key variable. If capitalism is driven by profitability, then profitability is a thing you should need to look at, right? This is the profit rate of the corporate sector from 1947 to 2011, and it begins, you can see, it falls. But it's also modified. You see in the middle there is this big upturn And that's the Vietnam War boom. That's Keynesian policy stimulus. But you notice that it peaks and then it comes back down. So the overall trend, if you adjust for the fluctuations, the trend of a normal capacity utilization profitability is falling through the whole post-war period until Reagan and Thatcher come into power. And one could argue that they came into power precisely because there was a growing opposition to Keynesian and employment pumping policies from the capitalist class who was paying the price of a lower profit rate. And that led to the profit rate being stabilized. It was stabilized because wages were reduced. That's the first picture I showed you, if you remember. Productivity rising and then the real wage flattening. So that difference is what Marx would call a rise in the rate of surplus value, a tremendous rise in the rate of exploitation. That stabilized the profit rate. But that wasn't the only thing. The interest rate was also lowered tremendously. And capitalism investment depends on the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. And by stabilizing the profit rate and lowering the interest rate, the incentive to accumulate became very great, and you got a boom, a real boom, that meant more employment, more jobs, rising standard of living, not really because wages were rising, but women were in the workforce, so family standards of living were rising, and higher profits, much higher profits. So, but however, lowering the interest rate meant that it was very cheap to borrow, so you get bubbles. You get stock market bubbles, you get real estate bubbles, you get capital moving rapidly across the world, buying property everywhere, investing, financial bubbles of all sorts. So the very thing that saved the system was the thing that led to the 2008 crisis. Again, what are bubbles driven by? Profitability. Not by bad decisions. They made perfectly good decisions. And if they were smart and got out, they became extremely wealthy. In a period of rising profitability and of rising asset prices, it makes sense to invest in them to make money and make profit. So the fact is the system then balances itself, of course, by the collapse. Two more points. The theory of competition that I present in the book is what I call real competition. And by real competition, I mean competition as warfare. Now, that means that firms attack each other. Firms don't just passively sit, they've set prices. How else are prices going to be set? When you walk into a shop, it's not the Walrasian auctioneer who comes out of a bottle and tells you what the price is. The price is on the good because the owner of the shop put the price on. That's how prices are set. But that doesn't mean they can set any prices. If they set a price too high, then you go somewhere else. So they're constrained by competition. And they're constrained by the fact that all of their other shops, all the other shops near them or within your reach will want your business and they want to take it away from them. So firms compete for market share. And that competition is driven by profitability. That constrains the price. It keeps it within bounds. And if in the process, in some industries, profit rates are higher and other industries are lower, then capital flows more rapidly towards the industries where profit rates are higher. It increases supply relative to demand. It brings the prices down by increasing the supply, so it brings the profitability down. So this is the classical idea of profit rate equalization. I'm not going to pick all the plant and equipment which is 30 years old or 40 years old or 10 years old. I'm going to pick the newest plant and equipment that I can use, can expand. So what is going to be relevant is the rate of return on new investment. And the same here, the rate of return on new investment will be what will cause capital flows. So we expect the rate of return on new investment to be equalized. And we can measure that. We can look at investment and we can look at the change in profit and we can get an estimate of the new capital and the new profit, and that's the rate of return on new investment, which I call the incremental rate of profit in the book. And if you measure that, notice how different it looks. This is what equalization of profit rates mean. They're not equal. They go above and below. You gain an advantage and your competitors take it away and you sink below. Marx actually refers to this as a cycle of lean and fat years. Some years you're not doing well, some years you are doing well, and then the lean years come after that because, of course, firms are fighting with each other for market share. So this establishes that profitability is equalized, but it is the rate of profit on new investment. And that opens up the path to the theory of effective demand. Because investment moving from one sector to another, motivated by profitability, and this profitability has to be net of whatever interest is, because if you left your money in the bank, you get an interest rate. So if you take a risk, you have to get a rate of return higher than that. So Marx calls that the motivation for accumulation. Investment is determined by the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. Well, when you read Keynes, the first thing he says is investment is determined by the difference between the marginal efficiency of capital and the interest rate. But the marginal efficiency of capital, if you go down further and read what he says, is a rate of return on new investment. So the same thing that determines stock prices, bond prices, interest rates, prices of goods, of commodities, and so on, and the theory of real competition also determines accumulation. And that means that the movement of profitability net of interest becomes the central regulator. I'm going to talk tomorrow in the conference on Marx and Keynes about the link between Marx and Keynes, so I don't want to spend too much time here. The point here is that the same approach allows us to explain Keynes's argument also. The phenomena that Keynes establishes, as well as the things his followers did not see and could not understand, which is why how Keynesian pumping can lead to inflation even if you have plenty of unemployment. If you're a macroeconomist, you know that's a puzzle. But here it's not a puzzle. It's a natural consequence of the process. This is a graph of something that David Ricardo postulates. He says that competitive prices will be very close to direct and indirect labor times, weighted by wages. And this is the actual data for the United States, and you see that he's exactly right. They are extremely close. And I show this for repeated samples. I'm going to skip a little bit on the theory of inflation because of time, to just say that what I showed was just a small part of the book. But the main point I want to emphasize is that all of these derivations come from the same principles. There's a small set of principles. Real consumer behavior, real firm behavior, competition, and therefore real macro dynamics, which are based on those two. And that means that we could have a path all the way from micro to macro. So I ask you to think about this project. Suppose you take any standard textbook, micro and macro, and you segregate the book into two parts. Those parts that claim to explain real patterns, and those parts that explain the justification, motivation, welfare, optimality, and you cut those two sets of pages and you put them aside, and then put the book back together. That's the positive part. That's the part that we can explain without that second part. The second part is ideological. It's designed to make you believe that capitalism is the optimal system, and that if it were not for your behavior, your imperfections, this is like the accusation of the Catholic Church against the snake, right? That's the cause of humanity's miseries. That isn't the cause. And orthodox economics leads us into a fantasy world from which we cannot get out unless we wake up from the dream and say, no, we start somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwar Shaikh. Procedemos ahora a unos minutos de preguntas y respuestas, para lo cual está muy dispuesto el profesor Shaikh a hacerlo, y el doctor Perrotini nos va a ayudar en caso necesario. A ver, la primera pregunta por allá. Como sea.
how the richest, the capitalist class, are actually making a war against most of the humanity, because there is less education, public education, the state is losing money, right? So my question is, don't you have a graph, a plot of the richest companies versus the others, the rate of profit?
Yes, that's a very good point, but keep in mind that in my theory of competition, the point is that there are winners and losers. I mean, it would be like my saying, look, in every war there are people who survived and did well, therefore I should segregate them from the losers. But the whole point is they did well because the others died, and it doesn't follow that they can continue to do well. There's considerable literature on the fact that so-called monopolies, I didn't address that question directly, but implicitly I did, that so-called monopolies have the power to withdraw themselves from the war of competition. There's considerable evidence that they don't. Many, many big firms that were considered monopolies went bankrupt. And every day you read in the papers, Nokia goes down, General Motors goes down. General Motors was saved only because of the state coming in. Otherwise, it was bankrupt. Chrysler, Ford, Rolls-Royce, the list goes on and on. So it doesn't follow that just because there's a dispersion that the average is not meaningful. The dispersion, the two sides of that dispersion are precisely what produce the average. I did emphasize that the average which is relevant is the average on new capital, not on average capital, because no one's going to care about investment in an old machine. But new machines, yes. So that is why the data is that way. There's a discussion in the book also of wages, which I didn't bring about here, but about how the equalization of wages, which is a classical idea, manifests itself as a dispersion. And in fact, everything could be said to manifest itself as a dispersion, but we need to know what the mean is also, not just what the tails are. Yeah. Not only is my eyesight bad, but my hearing is bad also, so.
Okay. Yeah, I really like your presentation. I would like to read the book. I have two questions. Marx assumed, one important assumption in Marx theory is that there are social classes. You didn't mention that. I assume.
Say that again. Marx assumes that there is?
That there are social classes.
Social classes,
yeah,
yes.
And you didn't mention that very basic assumption of Marx. Could you elaborate more on that regarding your basic assumptions to design this general theory? The second question I have is about if you apply your theory to explain some of the empirical evidence, could you use your theory to, or give me an example, or how could you explain empirical evidence about robots starting to replace labor? I understand, as far as I understood, you say that profitability governs the main empirical evidence. So I would like to know your opinion about this technological change in which robots are playing a very important part. So there are two questions about the social classes, and the next one about the technical change, these trends in the current capitalism. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Those are very good questions. As I said, I only presented a kind of slice of the book, so there are other places where I discuss some of these issues. It seems to me that one of the points I've tried to make throughout is that Marx discusses social classes, but he doesn't say that capitalism is run by the capitalist class. And that's an important point, because the whole reason for bringing in the idea of competition as a regulator, which he develops fantastically importantly. You see every relative prices, a little bit on interest rates, rents, and all of that is coming from competition. And that is because competition is the internal struggle of the capitalist class. They are not unified. They don't exist as such any more than the working class exists as such. They have certain commonalities, but they also have deep and abiding differences, and competition is the expression of that difference. To put it differently, Marx begins by saying that capital as a unit is self-expanding value. But that self-expanding value brings it into conflict with other self-expanding values, and competition is the expression of the laws produced by that conflict. And that's why he talks about the laws of motion of the system rather than the laws of power of the system. Obviously, he emphasizes that this is an unequal power system, but the market has power over the capital. That's one of the points I try to make throughout. There is no such thing as capital. When the capitalist class, when it gets a depression, is not because it chose to do that. Many of them end up being wiped out. That's because the consequence of their logical and natural profit-seeking behavior. And that leads to this question of robotization. I spent some time in the book about the development of a reserve army of labor. And robotization is one of the tools there, because when the unemployment rate shrinks, the reserve army becomes small, then the barriers that prevent people from entering the system become porous magically. Immigrants are allowed in. Previously, black people and women are not allowed to work, are suddenly told, we love you, we'd like you to work. And then when that pool becomes big, they're kicked back out again, if they can be. So it is in the hands of capital. As Marx puts it, the dice are loaded because they are on both sides. They can determine both the displacement of labor and the pickup of labor, and they can adjust both, and that's how they maintain a pool, a persistent pool. One of the points I make in the book is that this persistent pool is on the world scale. It should not be understood to be in any given locality, because capital is on a world scale. So its pool is on a world scale. So what does that have to do with robotization? Robotization is the latest expression of the absolute imminent tendency of changing the labor process to make it more perfect from the point of view of capital. There's a discussion in Marx about labor and modern machinery and modern industry, about how the speeding up of the process means that as you speed it up, the human elements become limits to the further speeding, and then they get replaced, and so on and so on. That means that it is already implicit. The building of robots goes back to industrial capitalism. It's the first forms of machinery that do the work that humans do. But now the point is that robots have come to the point where they can do intellectual activities that previously they weren't able to do. Then the question becomes, why are they used? Well, every capitalist will tell you why, because it's cheaper. They can sell it to people to do it, work at home, if the people can afford it, but they do it in the factories because they can work it faster, and they don't organize, they don't complain. If they break down, you toss them aside, so they are, from that point of view, the ideal worker. That then raises a more important question: where does this go? Where does the system go if it progressively replaces labor based on the profit motive, and therefore has a shrinking pool of perhaps highly skilled workers? I don't think the problem with capitalism is a lack of demand. Capitalism is very able to create demand in a variety of ways. The problem then is that it's going to have an oversupply of people, oversupply relative to its needs. And I notice that capitalism has already historically provided solutions to that. A war is a way of culling the population. It kills off millions, and capitalist wars have gotten bigger and more destructive. Unemployment also means that people remain trapped outside the system, and perhaps they'll never come back in. But there's a third one, which is birth control, population control. In China, they do it explicitly, forcibly. But in capitalism, the wonderful thing about it is that people voluntarily self-extinguish. That is to say, if you educate people and give men and women jobs, they have fewer and fewer children, and therefore they extinguish their own cohort. And many people have pointed this out. Piketty shows all the population growth rates, all voluntary. Capitalism is adjusting to its needs by giving more freedoms of a certain type. Now, they could give other kinds of freedoms that would keep the population up, but not surprisingly, those are not so popular because they're not so profitable. So I think we need to look at ourselves in this context also as participating in these gravitational fields. What seems like choices we've made are choices which happen to be also often very consistent with what the system needs. I personally like robots, but that's another story. I don't want them replacing me. I don't want my next lecture here to be from a box. So coming at home, yes, I love my computer, but I don't think that, and my university, by the way, doesn't necessarily agree and would probably like to replace me with the box because it's cheaper, that's all, it's simple.
Well, thanks to attending to all our questions. I would ask something about the profitability or profit. You mentioned in your presentation that profit, well, in the general presentation you mentioned that the decisions were not made by, well, let's say, but singular person. I mean, that it was not the domination of the singular person on his decisions, but it has to be with some other, it has to do with some other reasons like friendship or all moral elements. I would say that if it were the reason of decisions and profits, why is it that we have the climate change that doesn't mean profits or let's say profits to more people? If it is supposed that we are making people based on some other reason, not just like individual reasons, and that would be the question. Thank you.
Okay, if I understand, I think this relates back to my point that capitalism is driven by profit, and whether its effects on people are literally side effects. It's not the object of capitalism to provide employment. Otherwise, robots wouldn't be used, obviously. People wouldn't be unemployed. The object of capitalism is to figure out, at the micro level, each firm trying to figure out how they can get more profits and how they can beat their competitors. The consequences are environmental degradation. And I often say, you know, if you were in their place, you would probably do the same thing because the incentive structure is such. If you can create lots of toxic chemicals and dump them in the river, you don't have to pay for them, then your costs are lower. And if your costs are lower, you have a better probability of surviving in the battle of competition. So that's perfectly sensible. That tells us that if you want to stop environmental degradation, then you have to attack profitability. They know that. That's precisely why they resist. It's not like they haven't read the same textbooks that we have. They know perfectly well that that means it's going to cut profitability. Same thing for wages. You know, we say, my post-Keynesian friends say, well, if you raise wages, it'll raise aggregate demand. Well, that assumes those workers are still going to have jobs. And the neoclassical economists would say, no, it's going to reduce the amount of jobs. The fact is that in the real process, there's a space in which you can raise wages without reducing jobs, and there's obviously a space where if you raise wages enough, the jobs will disappear and aggregate demand will actually fall because people won't have jobs. So you have to be concrete about these spaces. Obviously, Indian workers cannot fight for the same wage as US workers. The productivity is much higher in the United States than it is in India, and the space that you have is much smaller, therefore. And that's everybody at the level of the struggle, labor struggle, they understand this. They know that if you ask for too much, the firm may close down. It may move to another place. These are all the concrete limits. And if we approach it that way, then you see the important dominating role of profitability. With two more points here. I also argue that for the same reason, the effects of individual profitability decisions can be bad for the system itself. Marx's idea, and Smith's, and Ricardo's, and Keynes, that capitalism produces an intrinsic falling rate of profit comes from the fact that the micro decision has macro consequences, which they cannot avoid because each one of them needs to do something to survive, but the collective effect is a falling profit rate. And I show in the book the path of the profit rate, but I also talk about the micro-decision process, how firms have to choose lower cost technologies. But if they choose lower cost, they have to construct the lower cost. If they cannot do it by just paying lower wages, because workers are going to fight back also, they do it by having more mechanized production. And that more mechanized production raises the capital intensity of production, and I show very concretely with the data that it lowers the maximum profit rate and therefore squeezes the profit rate, other things being equal. Now, that again comes about because profitability is an imperative at the local level, not at some kind of abstract capitalist class as a whole sitting in a room someplace deciding, because they all hate each other. It's just like the mafia. Yeah, maybe they get together and have dinner once in a while, but their people taste all the food first for a very good reason. Then the second, this is a point I didn't mention, but I argue this throughout the book, is that there are actually two sources of profit, not one. And not only do I argue that Marx knew this perfectly well, and he comments on it, and he approves of it, and the Marxist tradition has basically avoided understanding that. Marx refers to, if you open Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 1, Chapter 1, first page, James Stewart. And Stewart says there are two sources of profit. One is called profit on exchange or vibration, and the other is profit on production. And Marx goes right on. That's absolutely true. And Marx, I'm going to build a second one. I'm going to explain what you haven't explained. Where does profit on production come from? It's going to be at surplus value. And then I'm going to come back and deal with the other profit, which Marx says I'm going to call profit on alienation. Now, why does Marx have to admit this is true? Because before there was industrial capitalism, which comes about in England originally and then spreads as the dominant mode in a country, there was merchant capitalism, which goes back thousands of years. And merchants made a lot of money on trading. They would take something from one part of the world, either they would trade something cheap for it and then sell it for more, or they'd steal it. Usually that's better if you can, if you don't have resistance. And you take it somewhere else and you sell it and you make a big profit. And that profit is not based on surplus value, it's based on unequal exchange. Those are Marx's words. Well, the problem then becomes that when you get to the transformation problem, you have unequal exchange because prices differ from values. That's the whole point. And Marx says, I'm going to show you how this all applies, but he doesn't. Because we know he didn't write volume 3, he didn't even write volume 2. He dies without those being finished. So though we know he's going to do it, he doesn't do it. So part of what I try to do is show how you can explain that these are two sources of profit, and one of the side benefits of this is that you can explain financial profits, profits made by buying and selling the same thing again and again and again, but also you can explain the transformation problem. In fact, you can explain the fact that in every school of thought, there is a transformation problem. If you start from Marx, prices equal values, then transformation, they become different. If you start from Sraffa, prices are prices of production in the sense of Marx, but market prices are different, monopoly prices are different, and then profits are different. Where do these profits come from? It's not from the algebra. We have to explain where they come from. And it's exactly by showing transfers. And it turns out the necessary tools for that are already developed and in some length in Marx in volumes 1 and 2, which is circuits of capital and circuits of revenue. It's a balance of payments problem. Now, you can fault Marx for not having at least given us a little hint that these circuits are going to be used later, that he's going to develop them, but perhaps he did. Perhaps Engels didn't take from the raw material that Marx had in his horrible handwriting and masses of papers unfiled and all over the place, and Engels did the best he could. But we should be responsible for seeing there's a logic here. And that logic turns out to be very coherent and able to explain many phenomena, including financial profits.
I have a few questions also. The first is regarding one of the graphs that you showed, where you showed that that prices were proportional to labor time, and you related this to Ricardo's theory of value. So empirically, if this comes out to be true, how do we account for variation in the organic composition of capital? Because according to Marx, this organic composition of capital would lead to an equalization in the rate of profit that would lead to difference in price of production that were different from value, right? So if labor time ends up being proportional to price, despite this equalization in the rate of profit, what is happening? How do we explain this? Is it the case that the organic composition is not meaningfully different across sectors of production, or what is the case? A second question that I wanted to ask is, you account for how the capitalist system always overshoots and undershoots, and this is a kind of adjustment process of creating order through disorder. What can we expect to arise from the great stagnation that has been lagging from the 70s, ending up in the crisis of 2008? Can we expect a new cycle of rising, of boom and overshooting? If so, what would it require? Because the last phase of, as you explained, the last phase of overshooting was thanks to neoliberal policies, but now these have been apparently insufficient. So what can we expect to happen next? And lastly, I wanted to ask, in the rate of profit that you show, how do you account for world trade and transfers of value within this rate of profit? If it's only calculated for the United States, what happens to surplus value that is actually appropriated from dislocated production in other parts of the world? How is this presented in this data? That's it.
Okay, let me start them in reverse order. The rate of profit I measure is the actual realized rate of profit. It's not based on surplus value and so on. I'm looking at the profits that capitalists achieve. Now, you can make a different argument about how much of it comes from inside and outside, and I do that in a book I wrote about 15 years ago called Measuring the Wealth of Nations. But here, I was concerned to show what it is and what its dynamics are. And some part of it does come from the outside, and that can be measured. But that was not my concern, because what motivates capitalism in the center, in the end, is how much profit it makes, rather than where it comes from. It doesn't care, in that sense, where it comes from. At that level. Overshooting, undershooting. Yes, if the patterns hold. I always qualify this because the patterns need not hold. Japan went into a crisis in the 1980s, Great Depression, and never came out. Why? Because they also didn't allow the mechanisms that caused the recovery to take place. That is, they did not allow the destruction of capital value and unemployment and the destruction of wages and so on, which are the recovery mechanisms. Concentration, centralization. So in effect, they've been stuck, the movie stopped in that frame, and they've been stuck essentially in a stagnation. Is that bad? No. Who would object to living at a high standard of living that they have in Japan? Yes, okay, you pay $20 for a cup of coffee, but if you're Japanese, you can afford it because the income is also high. So it doesn't follow that the patterns will recur if they're blocked, but then other consequences follow. Japanese profitability is low, it's stagnant, its growth of labor is low, the population growth is also very low, so they are in a place where they cannot get out without doing what they don't want to do. The US and England, on the other hand, got out of that crisis by allowing the destruction of capital value of banks, businesses, as well as of labor, of wages. So if that pattern holds in the US, if it doesn't interfere, then the next peak will be roughly 2040 if these patterns hold, because they're roughly 40 years apart. You can see that from the data, which, by the way, as I said, is in my book. So you can use it, smooth it, and figure this out for yourself. The graph on the prices of production thing, the graph I showed was not that prices are proportional to labor time, but they are close. And that is because Ricardo himself makes the argument that prices differ from labor time. It's, in his numerical example, is very clear that they differ, but he argues that this difference is bounded. So that raises a mathematical question, which I address in the book, which is how do differences in organic composition of capital map into differences in prices from values? And I show that there's a big damping factor, which I look at mathematically, but also empirically, so that a big dispersion in organic compositions of capital ends up as a small dispersion of prices from labor values. And that's why the data is what it is. I also look at market prices, which are different, and show that they differ from both of those and so on. So the data is from input-output tables, and since I've already got it measured, people can go ahead and play with it and see. What strikes me is that Ricardo and Marx were much smarter than we were, because they could see these patterns and they posed it for us as questions, and we kind of lost track of that. And that's our fault for not paying attention, so to speak. You know, the best people can do is leave you a guide, but then if you wander off into a forest somewhere else, that's your problem, not theirs. Yeah?
I have a question.
Creo que hay probablemente muchas más preguntas y esto es porque realmente ha sido una exposición muy buena del libro. Hay dos formas en que ustedes pueden tener respuesta a sus preguntas. Una es asistiendo mañana al seminario de Marx y Engels en la Facultad de Economía, en el Auditorio Ho Chi Minh, a las 12, y la otra es comprando el libro y leyéndolo, o por lo menos consultándolo. ¿Sí? Ya sé que muchos de ustedes algunos más bien, son ajenos a la lectura, lo hemos observado, no todo existe en el internet, lamentablemente, hay que leer, ¿sí? Se lo digo a mis estudiantes casi diario. Nos queda una última intervención, una pregunta de parte del doctor Ignacio Perrotini y finalmente la respuesta de Anwar Shaikh cierra esta sesión. Tenemos que retirarnos a otro evento. Muchas gracias.
Well, I have a question, Anwar, for you. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for such a great presentation of your book. And then I would like you to give us a sense about a subject that I know it's dealt with in your book, but I mean, it's such a relevant topic that has gained quite some currency in our school, and it would be very good for our students to, to listen to your point of view from the perspective of your book, please. So the point is, I mean, the question is, what do you make of the theory of financialization as an explanation of the current financial crisis?
Yes, I discussed that in that chapter 16 of the book. I tried to link the issue of financialization to two things, profitability and the interest rate. So once again, I'm trying to show that we can explain what happened from the basic principles, and that's the theme of the whole book. Everything I do related back to the basic principles and show you that you pretty much would get a certain expected pattern. And so what is that? I don't think financialization was the cause of the current crisis. The financialization was the expression of the solution to the previous crisis. And there's a difference. The previous crisis was one in which profitability was falling and was stagnant, falling all throughout the post-war period. And then by the time you come to the Reagan-Thatcher era, the neoliberal era, the solution to that stagnation and crisis of the 1970s was an attack on labor and a lowering of the interest rate. And that means that the interest rate is now no longer allowed to be following its market principle. It's pushed down. We know the mechanisms. You buy and sell bonds, and you do QE1 and QE2 and so on. But that meant that there was a big boom for capital because the profit rate was falling and it was stabilized. The interest rate was all the way up here, and it was lowered. So the gap between the two became big, and capitalism roared across the whole globe because of these mechanisms. However, that same solution produced financialization, because with the interest rate so cheap, it's possible to spread financial capital across the globe and to do things that were not previously feasible. And they're pretty much well documented why that is. So I think that then that bubble created by that burst, as it must inevitably burst because it was not consistent with the foundations. Now, here's an interesting argument along the same line, which I cite in the book at some length, which is the argument by George Soros. George Soros says the way he makes his money is to catch the ride of the bubble on the way up, and then when he begins to feel that it's far away from the fundamentals, he gets out before the rest of us do, which is usually how that works. So we are sitting after the bubble is collapsed, you're going, uh-oh, it's too late, and he gets out on the way up, and by and large, he's been very good at that. But the point he makes is that bubbles are normal. They are the expression of the movement of capitalism, and how he made himself a billionaire was exactly to understand how this works, concretely. Again, concretely. It's fine to talk about bubbles. I know about bubbles, but I haven't got any money any more than my salary, because I don't know how to do anything with that abstract knowledge. You need it concretely. Plus you need a lot of money to lose also. Now, the financialization, however, plays a role in my book in a different way, not only explaining the collapse of the bubble and the burst. So I don't think this crisis was caused by that, as I say. The crisis was caused by the fact that the recovery set up this bubble in the first place, and there was a real boom. But I also can explain from the same mechanism Piketty's arguments about inequality. I argue in the end of the book, I mention it briefly, but I have a paper on my homepage, which you can find, which is a different explanation of Piketty. And I use exactly the same two elements. I show that I can explain the Gini coefficient in any country by two variables alone, by one variable alone, which is the ratio of the incomes at the top to the ratio of the incomes at the bottom, or more specifically by the ratio of incomes from property to the income from labor. Now, what happened in the neoliberal era is that the income from property went up dramatically for two reasons. One is because profitability went up, and that's the income from ownership of capital. And secondly, because the circulation of financial assets became a spiral shooting upward, because each round made money for some people who bought it and sold it. And you can track those numbers, and I show that you can use that to explain the Gini coefficient. And this explanation is not mine, but that of a physicist named Viktor Yakovenko, who has what I call the two-class theory of income distribution. And he says that the law of the distribution of labor income is an exponential, and the law of the distribution of property income is Pareto. Pareto originally discovered that law while he was looking at property income, by the way. That's how he discovered it. And what Yakovenko shows is that these two can be joined together with one variable, which is the ratio of property income to labor income. So what I've done is show why the property income goes up as it does. And I can then explain what happens to the Gini coefficient and why we went from a stable Gini coefficient in 1947 to 1980, which is so-called golden age of labor and of capitalism, to a sharply rising Gini coefficient once you let loose financial capital and you also suppress labor. And that means that we don't have to invent a new principle to explain the patterns. These are generic patterns under historical social conditions, because that class struggle was a crucial dividing of the first part and the second part. Workers lost, and then capital was deregulated, so the state was reduced, and you get this big explosion. But that's sensible. That's the key point.
Pues con esto cerramos el día de hoy la presentación del libro de Anwar Shaikh. Como les digo, estamos queriendo que sea publicado por el Fondo de Cultura Económica Sede México, y justamente a eso nos dirigimos en un rato más. Agradecemos la presencia de todos ustedes y de las autoridades de la facultad y del posgrado. Muchísimas gracias.